What is up, Nickel City Mafia? Welcome to a special series we're going to be having for you. Joining me today is Chris Caldwell. And Chris has been involved in fantasy football for somewhere around 20 years. And we're going to be bringing you a series of shows talking about the various fantasy football leagues. I'm very familiar with this one. We're going to get into the redraft leagues, but there's some other ones that I get invited to and I know nothing about. Chris is going to help us understand all about these leagues, how we can get an edge on our competitors, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself and tell the folks a little bit more about yourself? He obviously, if you're a Nickel City Mafia follower, Chris has been on our show. He's part of our channel. He does the fantasy football shows with Rick Mukherjee, and hopefully they'll get that started up again this year. But this is going to help you guys a lot learning about these different leagues. So, Chris, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for the invite. And yeah, like you said, I started playing fantasy football in middle school. Might have been first year of high school. Don't really remember, but I remember my math teacher put together like a fantasy baseball league, fantasy football league, and I'm a real big math guy. I was a stat major in college. I work at NASA now with numbers, so big stat nerd, big math nerd, but I also love sports. So fantasy football is a natural fit. One would say I'm addicted to it, and one would be my wife. But hey, it's been a profitable endeavor for me. Started out playing leagues like you were saying, the redraft leagues, like you get into with friends, family, work. Kind of your casual leagues, I'd call them. That's kind of what I started with, but the more and more I got into it and really fell in love, I found out that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and we have five different types of fantasy football leagues. That are out there regularly available now. They're becoming much more popular than they were 15, 20 years ago. I'd say in the last 3 to 5 years, the popularity of these other types of leagues has really blossomed. So excited to talk about them because I think a lot of our viewers are gonna find an interest in one of these leagues and join a new one this year.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I've been invited to these leagues and I've had to decline because I didn't know anything about them, and they usually don't give me a lot of notice. But the redraft league is the one league I'm very familiar with. Chris, I gotta put my age out there, but back in 1984, I was working at a sporting goods store, and a gentleman in the warehouse picked up a book. We sold books as well, sports. Back in the day when people actually had magazines, they purchased those. And he says, "Hey, I want to start this fantasy football league," and it was all in this magazine. And we're like, "Awesome, let's do it." So we started it with just offense only, and it was very basic, but it was so much fun. And back in those days, Chris, I didn't have an app telling me who was the best person to pick up. I didn't have anything. The only thing I had is I had to buy a magazine, and every Monday after the football games, I'd have to go and pick up a
Newspaper.
newspaper.
Hmm.
The good old days, man. So, Chris, let's get into it, man, because this is a fun um, league that most people are familiar with. So, the redraft league, you kind of mentioned it a little bit already. The casual type of league, typically friends, family, office league. And 80% of the fantasy advice is driven towards these leagues. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about it? I know there's this concept of PPR, non PPR, half PPR. And can you kind of describe what the heck that means?
Yeah, sure. So normally if people are talking about, hey, join my fantasy football league, 9 times out of 10, they're talking about a redraft league. Not a lot of people call it this, but once you start playing other types of fantasy football leagues that we'll get into in some other shows, people that play these dynasty leagues or keeper leagues, they'll refer to a regular league as a redraft league. Redraft just simply means you redo your draft every year. So you might have your same group of your 10 college buddies or your 12 friends at work or whatever it may be. It can be, the leagues kind of usually span anywhere between 8 players up to like 16, with eight being on the low extreme, 16 being on the high. 10 or 12 is usually your sweet spot there. But you redraft your league every year. People kind of see that as the fresh start. While there might be better players or worse players, everyone has a new chance every year, right? Because you're redrafting your team. Your injuries are a thing of the past. Build that whole new roster, and either pay your money or play for bragging rights all over again. So yeah, that's what's meant by the redraft league. And most shows that you'll casually watch on ESPN with like Matthew Berry, or you look up something on YouTube, they're talking about redraft leagues. So this is just your run of the mill league, and yeah, like you said, bunch of different scoring settings. You can get a certain amount of points per yards gained, a certain amount of points per receptions gained, a certain amount of points per touchdown, and that's up to your league commissioner to set those settings. And a really important thing to do. Most people just kind of join at the last minute and say, "Hey, when's the draft?" It's really important to look at the settings of your league and understand your construct of your roster, meaning, how many QBs do I start? How many running backs do I start? How many wide receivers do I start? How many tight ends? And also, what's the scoring of each one? Mike, I know you had a problem. I'll get to it in a minute, but you had an issue with this last year where you were in a 2 QB league and you didn't know it during the draft. You're a little
No.
bit behind the 8 ball. So me and Rick were trying to catch you up all year. But anyway, it's very important to understand your scoring, because the way that you draft will be very different based if it's a point per reception league, a PPR, or if it's not a PPR. You're going to draft completely different players. They'll be valued completely different. And actually, a good resource for this is Yahoo, which is a great fantasy football site. You can, if you join a league on Yahoo, and then before your draft, you can go to like the players button, and you can like rank them, and it'll put them in order based on the way that your league is set up, which is a really cool function. Actually, not a lot of people know about it. I shouldn't have said that out loud, but I use that often in when I'm in Yahoo leagues, because your players will be in order on your draft by the way that the public would typically draft them. Right? It's called ADP, or average draft position. But Yahoo will sort your players not in the draft, but if you go inside the league and sort the players, it'll sort them by the expected points gained that year based on the scoring settings of that league. So that's a nice tip right there if you're in a Yahoo league.
So you brought up a good point. Yeah, I was invited last year by my neighbor, and again, he gave me 1 day notice. Mike, we have an opening for our league. Do you want in? I'm thinking it's a redraft league. It's a standard one that I've played for many years. Yeah, I'll get in. So the draft comes along, and yeah, I'm seeing all these quarterbacks go off the board quickly. I'm like, what is going on here? Turns out it was a 2 quarterback league, and with the help of you and Rick, believe it or not, I was the number 1 team by the end of the year. I just had a couple of injuries hit me, which just kind of took me down. I made the playoffs as the top team, and I think I went out week 1, as a matter of fact. So it's a little disappointing, but yeah, it's super important for you to check out your scoring system and understand that league that you're being invited to. And like you said, Chris, based on that scoring system, the draft could change for you, right? It'll tell you who you need to focus on. Maybe there's a wide receiver you love, but it's a PPR league. And we didn't talk about that. Can you talk about what PPR means when I hear
Yeah,
that
sure.
term?
Yeah, PPR means points per reception. So for any time a running back, receiver, tight end gets a reception, it's 1 point. So if they catch a ball and it's for 0 yards and it's a 1 PPR league, then you get 1 point no matter what. So if you're in a league that's a half a point per reception or a full point per reception, it's important to note that, because in leagues that are full PPR leagues, you want to skew your draft towards wide receivers, and you want to skew your draft towards running backs that catch the ball more often, right? So if you're in a standard league that doesn't give a point for a reception, I'll just give a player example. Nick Chubb. Many will say, best natural running back in the NFL. Guy doesn't catch the ball though. So he's very valuable in a standard scoring or 0 PPR league. But in a 1 PPR league, his ceiling of where he could really finish on a given year is like seventh, eighth, ninth best running back, even if he crushes it because he doesn't catch the ball. There's other running backs like Austin Eckler and Tony Pollard and guys that are great receivers that are going to have 50, 60, 70 catches in a year. And that's like an extra 10 touchdowns. Do the math, right? So it's hard to keep up. So you really have to know your scoring and also your roster limits. So if you're in a PPR league that has three starting wide receivers instead of two, and also has maybe two flexes, that tells me I can start five receivers. So maybe five of my first seven picks are receivers. I'll go all in. I'll have the best receiving crew in the league, and maybe not everyone else is quite picking up on how valuable those receivers are. And I'll kind of deal with my quarterback and running backs later on. So it's things you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, good stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the waiver wire types? Because, most redraft leagues, they just do the standard waiver wire where whoever's in last place gets the first pick of the bunch. And I used to do that all the time, but it frustrated me one year because I drafted so well and I was in first place. And then one week, two or three of my guys got injured and were out for the season. And because no one wanted to trade with me because I was already leading the league, and everyone else was soaking up all those available players that were out there in the waivers, I didn't win another game the rest of the year, Chris, and it frustrated me. And then I found this thing called Fab. So can you kind of talk a little bit about the waiver wires?
There's three main kinds of ways to set your waivers. So there's the one that you said, most people call it like reverse standings or something like that,
Yeah.
reverse order. So basically it means no matter what, every Monday or Tuesday, the first place team will pick last, the last place team will pick first, and it'll repopulate every week. I will go out on a limb. It's actually not going out on a limb. I will tell you that is the absolute most garbage, worst way to do it, because we see every year there's two, three, four, five, six waiver darlings that I'd almost want to be last place the first couple
Yeah.
weeks, because like week 2, 3, 4, there's always studs that are, unknown, that are picked up, that are league winners. So it may be actually beneficial to have a good team lose on purpose for a couple weeks and then just crush your waiver wire. Not a lot of people will do that, but you get my point. Is like that's a terrible way to do this. The other two ways, I'll go over the one first, is called I don't know the name of it, but um it's a random order to start, right? Someone has the first pick, someone has the last pick. Once you use your pick, using it as in you say, I want the player. If you successfully pick up that player, you go to the end of the line. And then, so if say you don't pick up a player that week, you notch your way up to the front of the line as people use their picks and go to the back of the line. This way is pretty good because you can be strategic. Say there's this receiver there and you kind of like him, you think he has promise, but you're not really going to start him. He doesn't have a way into your starting lineup, but you think, sure, I'll throw him on my bench and see what happens. But you have the number one or number overall pick in the waivers currently. Do you want to use that on that player? Probably not, right? Because then you'll go all the way back 12th place in the line, and then you'll have to slowly inch your way up the line as people use their waiver week over week. So a lot of times what sharp players will do is they just refuse to pick up a player week 1, 2, 3, however long it takes for them to sit at pick 1 or pick 2, and they will wait for that one player that has like been doing a little bit here and there, and all of a sudden he erupts, or like an injury happens. Like for example, a couple of years ago, Dalvin Cook got hurt, and his backup running back Antonio Madison, absolute league winner, because Cook was out. Madison was showing some promise. He was thrust into 30 touches a game, and anyone that had number one waiver just crushed because the guy did wonderful. So that's another waiver type.
So,
Yeah.
Chris, I believe the official term is called rolling waivers.
Rolling. Thank you. Yeah.
Right, and most basic leagues use the reverse standings, which is what you started with. But there's this other one which I think is the best. I would love to hear your opinion. They call it the Fab League, which is like a free agency acquisition budget. I know that's a fancy term, but
Mhm.
tell the folks what that means and how that's utilized during waiver week.
Yeah, so Fab is easily the best way to do waivers. The rolling will be the second best way. The reverse standing's terrible, but Fab is free agent acquisition budget, and it's a lot like an auction, right? Eventually we're going to talk about how to do an auction draft, but this is kind of a little flavor of that. It's auction free agents. So every week, the players that are not rostered, there is a period. It's usually like 2 days after the Monday Night Football game. You have 2 days to put a bid on any player that's not rostered. It's a blind bid. Every team has the ability to put in that bid. The typical starting budget is $100 per year. Once you spend it, you lose it. You don't get it back. So some people, they'll see a really hot free agent and they'll say, I want to spend 70, $80 on this guy because I think I really need a new running back and he's been great. I'll go all in and get this guy. And that's great. But then what happens when 3 weeks later, your QB gets hurt and you can't really replace him because there's no one good available. So there's different strategies with how to spend your fab money. Do you spend it all on one or two players, or do you piecemeal it up and say, I'm going to kind of allocate $15, $20 to make sure I can buy, five different guys throughout the year? So different ways to do it. I personally like to save my money. So then, people kind of spend and spend. So then after week 5 or 6, if there's a player left that, has really been, showing pretty good and an injury happens, I just look to see, okay, the top guy has $62 left. So I'll just bid 63 for that player and I know I have him. So a couple different strategies to do there, but it's definitely, I'll call it the most fair strategy, most fair setting.
Yeah, it's the one. I mean, once you go Fab, you never go back. I'm
Exactly.
serious, man.
Yeah.
I played a lot of the reverse standings, played a lot of that, and once I went to Fab, man, it was like, let's go, game on. And if anyone asked me to join the league, it's the first thing I asked them. What are the waiver wires? What are we doing here? Fab.
Mhm.
And is there any leagues? I mean, so I know you said 100, but it's up to the commissioner. They can set 1,000, whatever, right? But 100 is
Mhm.
kind of the way to go, I think, and it's a lot of fun. It adds a whole new dynamic. So, Chris, this has been great. I want to ask one more question. We'll wrap this up. I want to know, I mean, you may have talked about it a little bit early on, but give me some tips to be successful in this league and have an edge over the folks that I'm going up against.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more that goes into fantasy football than number one that I think most people want to realize, and also that most people want to put the time into. So I think the first thing is just understand your league mates. Um, Everyone has a hometown. Everyone has a favorite team. Just pay attention to people's conversations, and you can kind of just get a natural feel of what kind of player, fantasy player that person is. If they're a little bit more like it's someone. This might sound silly, but hear me out, Mike. Um, I'm a big poker player too, so I use these same kind of tells. Like poker player and fantasy football, a little bit the same, right? So if there's a guy at your draft and he's got that iron polo on, he's very prim and proper, doesn't really get out of line, you know what I mean? He's probably going to pick, pretty much in order that's set up, the order that the league will show that the players should be drafted. Not going to do anything too wild, not going to have a crazy strategy like drafting 6 wide receivers in a row. He's usually going to be plain Jane. But if there's someone a little bit louder, that's going to be a risk taker, right? He's not necessarily going to take one of the next two or three players in the list. He's going to draft someone 20 spots ahead, and then he's going to say, watch this. This is going to be the big breakout player this year. I'm telling you. So just little things like that. I'm telling you, it might not always be true, but I find that just trying to understand what type of players you're drafting against and also trading with, right? So if you have that brash personality, that might be someone you go to, like say you have Justin Jefferson and he goes off for 3 touchdowns. I bet that really, out there brash player, he's going to want that person and willing to trade, their whole team for them more than someone else. So it's kind of like playing the mental game too, is like, put in the time, be aware of your surroundings. And I would say just on that, in that same vein, when you're trying to trade with people, or when you're drafting and you're looking around at, you have to be very aware of other people's team, right? So what other people have is just as important as what you have. So when you're trading, so I get so many stupid offers because someone will offer me a trade and I'm thinking like, whether it's fair or not is kind of beside the point. It's like, why would I want to do that? It doesn't make my team better. So when I offer a trade, it's, say I need a wide receiver, I look for a team that needs something that I'm robust at, right? So if I have, two outstanding QBs and it's a, one QB league, I'm going to scroll through the teams and offer trades to the two teams that have a QB injury or a bad QB. So you have to be willing to like be aware of your surroundings and, offer trades that make just as much sense for the other team as they do for you, because it's very frustrating and you can kind of like lose interest with the other players if you're just offering random trades. You have to, offer the trade, then send them a text and say, "Hey man, I offered you a trade and here's why." You don't have to be a used car salesman, but just say, "Hey, your QB's hurt and your second running back is on a bye. So I gave you a QB and a running back, and I just want one of your receivers. That's why I offered it." And if you can, be that aware of your league and aware of your players, it'll go a long way in helping you. So it's kind of like a you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of thing.
Yeah, don't be that person that says, look, I'm a Bills fan. Don't be that person that drafts every one of the Bills players because you have those bye weeks to worry about. And I know I've seen so many people just draft their favorite players off their team and they don't understand their league enough and they obviously fail. So don't be that person. I said this was the last question. Chris, what tools do you suggest we use to research players that we should draft? And also during the waiver wire week, what tools should we be using to choose those players?
The best one's definitely Nickel City Mafia football show.
I love it. There you go.
Yeah. So, yeah, Rick and I do a fantasy football show every week where we go over, the previous week's stats, the waivers for the upcoming week, and then we kind of do a session on, who's hot, who's not, buys and sells. So we really go over the previous week. Um, we try to get more in depth than just the box score. Anyone can pull up ESPN.com and look at the box score, but we try to say, what are you not seeing by that? What are you seeing by that? What's, read between the lines kind of thing. So definitely check out the Nickel City Mafia football show. Other tools that I use, because, I'm on the Nickel City Mafia show. I love Fantasy Pros. Fantasy Pros is a great website for weekly rankings and also like average draft, like ADP's average draft position. So basically, what they do is they take data from hundreds of thousands of drafts and they say, based on certain settings, this is what you can expect your league, your draft order to be in your league. So that's kind of a good tell of, oh man, I really want CD Lamb this year. Am I going to have to spend a first round pick, second round pick, or a third round pick on him? It's really good to plan ahead. So, if I'm in a pretty serious league, and I know my draft pick, what I'll usually try to do is before the draft starts, I'll jot down, 3 players that I want in the first round, 3 or 4 players I want in the second round, and so on. And I'll, try to have a plan. It's good to go in with a plan. Of course, be willing to deviate, but the more research you can do, look at these tools, figure out what players you could possibly get at what draft order is really helpful, because there's nothing more frustrating than you say, oh, okay, I'll take Josh Allen in the second round. There you go. I got my QB. Well, guess what? If you get to the fourth round and Jalen Hurts is still there, I'll tell you what, Josh Allen in the second round was a bad pick, right? Because you could have waited 2 rounds and got a QB who's equal to the one you picked earlier. It's good to have that plan and kind of know what you're getting into and map out your team and how you want it to look.
Yeah, and all the links, I'll put the links to those tools that you talked about in the description of this video. And the last thing, I mean, you didn't mention it, but it's kind of obvious. If you're in a league, these apps now that are out there, I mean, they'll auto draft for you. They'll give you a lot of data. They'll tell you who they think the best players should be for you to pick up in the waivers. And, in a crunch, it does a pretty good job because it looks at how you've set up the scoring system and it ranks those players based on that scoring system that's been set up by the commissioner. Do I have that right, Chris?
Yeah, I don't really use any of those apps, but I'll just say I'll give a shout out to my favorite fantasy football app. It's called Sleeper. We did a mock draft last year on the Nickel City Mafia. We used the Sleeper app. I'm really big into dynasty and keeper leagues, which we'll talk about shortly. But Sleeper was kind of it's easily the best to keep track of those types of leagues. Super slick interface. It puts out a news article on the player every week. It's like I probably spend an hour a day on Sleeper, even if I'm not keeping up with my fantasy football leagues. They have a great like little news section. It's like a ESPN, but solely for fantasy football. It's outstanding. So if you guys don't own Sleeper, go ahead and download that. It's pretty great.
Awesome. All right, Chris. Well, that does it. This was fun. We're going to get into the next shows in the near future. So we hope for all of you to kind of come back and check out those shows as well. But this was great. This gives you really, we went deeper into this one. I think the future shows will be a little less because we've touched on a lot of the basics. So you should start with this video, unless you're an advanced fantasy football person, and then you can jump right to the other ones. Chris, that was a lot of fun. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, sir. Let's get some wins.